Now imagine carrying a surname that you did not choose, a surname that as soon as you pronounce it makes people look away, a surname that appears in history textbooks along with words such as extermination, deportation and gas chambers. Imagine that surname is Himmler, or Göring, or Mengele. For most people who inhabit this planet, that question is a purely hypothetical exercise. But for a small group of men and women who were born in Third Reich Germany, that scenario was not an abstract nightmare. It was simply his life. Since they learned to speak, many of these children pronounced the same word as if it were an everyday greeting, Heil. They raised their arms with ease with that any other child says good days. They grew up in confiscated mansions, in villas with gardens where purebred dogs ran alongside servants brought from the occupied territories. They slept under portraits of the Führer and had breakfast with men who in the afternoon decided how many people should die that week. The Third Reich was not just a political and military machine, it was also a family project. The National Socialist doctrine enshrined the model of the large, Germanic and racially pure family as one of the fundamental pillars of the new order. The wives of the hierarchs competed with each other to represent the ideal of the Aryan wife and mother. The children of those same hierarchs were, in many cases, exhibited as living trophies of the racial superiority that the regime proclaimed. No one embodied that more clearly than Magda Goebbels, considered the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich. Together with her husband Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda and architect of total control of information in Germany, she had 6 children whose fate would be the darkest imaginable. Their names were Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun. They all began with the letter H in deliberate homage to the Führer. They were 12, 11, 9, 8, 6, and 4 years old when their parents made the decision that would seal their lives forever. But not all children in the Reich suffered the same fate. Some survived. In August 1941, a 12-year-old girl walked the corridors of the Dachau concentration camp with her father. In her diary, this girl wrote the following: "Today, we have been walking around Dachau, and Dad has shown me the gardens where lettuce, cereals and pear trees grow. Then we have seen the pictures painted by the prisoners. They were all very beautiful. In the end, we had a very good lunch." That girl was Gudrun Himmler. His father was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, commander-in-chief of the most powerful paramilitary organization in the Third Reich, chief architect of the concentration camp system, and one of the men most directly responsible for the extermination of millions of people in Europe. The Dachau camp, which little Gudrun described with the neutrality of a visitor to a botanical park, had been inaugurated on March 22, 1933, as the first of its kind. By 1941, when she walked its trails, tens of thousands of people had been imprisoned there in conditions of starvation, forced labor, and systematic violence. The entry in that diary is not the record of a monstrous creature. It is something more disturbing. It is the testimony of a girl who has been trained not to see, to look without understanding, to smile where we should cry. Gudrun Himmler was born on August 8, 1929 in the city of Munich, the only child of the marriage between Heinrich Himmler and Margarete Siegroth, a nurse of bourgeois origin. She was the only legitimate descendant of the hierarch, although Himmler also had an extramarital child with his secretary Hedwig Potthast. From the earliest years of his childhood, Heinrich showed a devotion to Gudrun that was striking in a man known for his administrative coldness. He called her Puppi, which in German means little doll. He wrote letters to him almost every week when Reich commitments prevented him from being at home. He had her flown from Munich to his headquarters to see her. In his few moments of rest, he would walk her through facilities that he himself supervised, showing them to her with the pride of someone who shows his work to a loved one. Parenting was dominated by ideology from the beginning. Unlike other sons of hierarchs who simply absorbed the environment without formal instruction, Gudrun was sent by her father to a Napola, short for National Politische Erziehungsanstalt, that is, an institution of national political education. These establishments were the most select in the Nazi educational system, reserved for the children of the party elite. Discipline was severe, military schedules, and ideological indoctrination was as systematic as instruction in mathematics or languages. Gudrun, however, did not excel academically and had to leave the institution before finishing his studies. Even so, the values absorbed in those years were engraved with the same depth that ash is embedded in stones. In April 1945, the world Gudrun knew began to crumble. Allied troops were advancing from the west and east on a collapsing Germany. Heinrich Himmler, who had been one of the most powerful figures in the Reich for 12 years, attempted in the last days of the conflict to negotiate with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back, an act that the Führer considered treason and which led to his expulsion from the party before the dictator's suicide. On May 23, 1945, Himmler was captured by British soldiers while attempting to cross the border with false documentation. He had shaved his mustache, shaved his head, and wore an eye patch over one eye. It was of no use. He was identified and arrested. A few hours later, he will bite into a cyanide capsule that he was carrying hidden in the cavity of a tooth and will die before anyone can stop him. The news reached Gudrun when she and her mother had already been detained by US forces. Mother and daughter were transferred to a succession of prison camps in Italy, France, and finally Germany. By 1946, they were taken to Nuremberg, where they were to testify in the most important judicial process of the century, the trial that tried the leaders of the Nazi regime for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Gudrun, then 16, testified in court what she knew and what she wanted people to believe she knew. She was released that same year. What came next was not the story of a woman confronting the past. It was the story of a woman who devoted the rest of her life to preserving it. In 1951, Gudrun Himmler joined an underground organization called Stille Hilfe, which is German for silent help. This entity, founded with the participation of such unlikely figures as Princess Sophia of Saxe-Weimar, operated as a support network for former members of the SS who were in compromised judicial situations, fugitives from justice or simply in need of economic resources to rebuild their lives under false identities. Through an extensive network of contacts that reached as far as Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, and Paraguay, Stille Hilfe provided documentation, money, and escape routes to war criminals who would otherwise have faced prosecution in Europe. One of the documented beneficiaries of this network was Klaus Barbie, the Gestapo officer nicknamed the Butcher of Lyon for the torture methods he used against members of the French resistance during the occupation. Barbie, who had managed to escape to Bolivia with the help of these networks, was finally extradited to France in 1983 and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1987 for crimes against humanity. Gudrun Himmler, according to later journalistic investigations, had helped finance part of his defense. In the 60s, an even darker chapter of his biography comes to light decades later. According to declassified German government files, Gudrun was employed between 1961 and 1963 by the Bundesnachrichtendienst, West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, under a false name. The agency was then commanded by Reinhard Gehlen, a Wehrmacht general who had directed intelligence operations against the Soviet Union during the war and who, after the defeat, was recruited by the American intelligence services before moving into the service of the new Germany. To rebuild the agency, Gehlen systematically hired people with proven ties to Nazism and experience in anti-communist activities. Gudrun was one of them. In 1963, after a restructuring of the federal government, she was fired along with other former party members. Over the next few decades, Gudrun adopted her husband's surname Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, a propagandist with Nazi sympathies, and became publicly known as Gudrun Berwitz. The change of surname fulfilled a pragmatic function. In post-war Germany, the name Himmler turned every bureaucratic effort into an interrogation. However, in his ideological circle, he never renounced his father's surname or the values that this surname represented. She was revered as the Nazi princess, and in some neo-Nazi meetings, she was called with macabre irony, Mother Teresa of the National Socialists. In 2015, a British journalist managed to get to the door of his house in Munich. He confronted her with direct accusations that she had aided murderers, that she had financed the defense of war criminals, that she was unscrupulous. Gudrun replied briefly, "I never talk about my work. I just do what I can and when I can." Gudrun Himmler died on May 24, 2018 in the city of Munich at the age of 88. Until the last day of his life, he wore a silver brooch in the shape of 4 horses arranged in a swastika, a gift from his father. His relatives did not publicly disclose his death. Not all of Heinrich Himmler's great-nephews followed this path. Katrin Himmler, a descendant of the hierarch's brother, published in 2005 the book Die Brüder Himmler, The Himmler Brothers, a rigorous and critical analysis of her family's role in the regime, the result of years of research in German archives. His position was diametrically opposed to Gudrun's, confronting the past as the only way not to repeat it. The gulf between Gudrun and Katrin Himmler is not just generational. It is the exact image of the moral fracture that Nazism left even within the same families. On June 2, 1938, on the large estate of Karinhall in the Schorfheide forest about 70 kilometers north of Berlin, a girl was born who was received by her father as if her arrival had been decreed by the same state. Because somehow it had been. His birth was announced throughout Germany with the solemnity of a national event. His godfather was Adolf Hitler himself. Her name was Edda Göring. His father was Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, creator of the Gestapo, Hitler's designated successor, and one of the most powerful and influential men in the Third Reich. It was also one of the most extravagant. His residence in Karinhall, named in honor of his first wife, the Swedish Karin von Kantzow, who died in 1931, was less a house than a private palace of unsuitable dimensions for any function other than the demonstration of power. It had marble wings, hunting halls, stables, an indoor swimming pool, and an art collection worth hundreds of millions of marks, part of which had been confiscated from Jewish families in the occupied territories and part directly stolen from the museums of the defeated countries. Edda grew up in that universe of unreal abundance. According to the testimonies collected in chronicles of the time, her father showered her with extraordinary gifts. Paintings by Flemish masters to adorn her childhood rooms, porcelain objects from the 18th century, wooden toys carved by Bavarian artisans. She ran through the corridors of Karinhall with the naturalness of someone who knows nothing else. Nazi propaganda used her image frequently, the blonde girl, the perfect daughter of the Reich. Göring's second wife, Emmy Sonnemann, a stage actress who had met the hierarch in 1932, naturally assumed the role of First Lady of the party that circumstances imposed on her. She was cultured, elegant, and politically less committed than Magda Goebbels, although she was equally installed in the bubble of privilege that the regime generated for her favorites. Edda adored her, and that mother-daughter relationship would be, for years to come, the only anchor of stability in a life that would turn into ruins. In January 1945, with the Eastern Front crumbling and the Soviet armies advancing into the heart of Germany, the Göring family left Karinhall. Hermann ordered the estate to be blown up with explosives before it fell into enemy hands. Decades of collection, tons of looted art, the palace that had been the most ostentatious symbol of Nazi power, all disappeared in a series of explosions. Edda was 6 years old. The roar of those detonations was the sound of the end of his world. Hermann Göring was captured by US troops in May 1945 in the town of Fischhorn, Austria. He was transferred to the Nuremberg trial, where he became one of the most visible defendants, defying the court with an intelligence that surprised his judges. He was sentenced to death for crimes against peace, war crimes and crimes against humanity on October 1, 1946. Edda and her mother were interned in a residence controlled by US forces in Bad Sachs, on German territory. There they lived in conditions of relative comfort, although without freedom of movement. In 1946, they were released. Edda was allowed to visit her father in Nuremberg prison on a relatively regular basis until the night of October 15, 1946, when Göring, hours before his scheduled execution, took his own life by ingesting cyanide. The pill, according to subsequent investigations, had been introduced into the cell through methods that the court never managed to definitively clarify. He was 53 years old. Edda was 8. What followed was a childhood and adolescence marked by poverty and stigma. Emmy Sonnemann, who had lived surrounded by luxury for more than a decade, had to rebuild an existence from scratch in destroyed post-war Germany. Edda accompanied her, first in modest Bavarian apartments, and then in a low-profile life that lasted for decades. The German government had seized all of Göring's assets, including the works of art that had not been destroyed in the Karinhall blast. In the following years, Edda would undertake a series of legal appeals to try to recover part of that heritage, arguing that many of the works had been personal gifts from her father. The German courts systematically rejected their requests. In her adult life, Edda worked for years in a rehabilitation clinic, where she acquired knowledge of nursing and medical care that would allow her to care for her mother in her old age. Emmy Sonnemann died in 1973. From then on, Edda gradually withdrew from any public life. In the few interviews he gave throughout his life, the pattern was always the same. Edda spoke of her father with visible affection, describing the family scenes at Karinhall, the games, the gifts, the domestic tenderness of a man who in historical records appears as one of the greatest criminals of the century. He did not deny the crimes of the regime with the ideological ferocity of Gudrun Himmler. He simply left them out of the picture. His father was the man who gave him paints for his room, not the man who ordered executions. Edda Göring died on December 21, 2018 in Munich at the age of 80. Her relatives did not publicly announce her death, and she was buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery in the city, in a decision that her relatives made to protect her even in death from the burden of a surname that she could never let go. A posthumous detail precisely defines the nature of his legacy. The ship to which friends and acquaintances of the Nazi elite were once invited, the yacht Karin II, which Hermann Göring had named in honor of his first wife, was photographed at a party in the 70s with Edda on board, smiling, surrounded by people who remembered the good old days of the Reich with a nostalgia that the rest of the world considered aberrant. That photograph, more than any public statement, reveals the world in which Edda lived, locked up. On May 10, 1941, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 aircraft took off from the Luftwaffe runway in Augsburg, Bavaria, at 5:45 p.m. In command was Rudolf Hess, the Third Reich secretary and number 2 official of the National Socialist Party. He was not carrying any passengers. He did carry a letter for his wife Ilse, photographs of their 3-year-old son, Wolf Rüdiger, and a mission that no one else in the German government knew about. 4 hours later, a paratrooper over the fields of Scotland in the vicinity of the town of Eaglesham, he was captured by a Labrador named David McLean. Hess claimed to want to meet with the Duke of Hamilton to negotiate peace between Germany and Britain. The British considered him at best a lunatic. In Berlin, Hitler ordered that Hess be said to have gone mad. Wolf Rüdiger Hess was born on November 18, 1937 in Munich. Its name was chosen in honor of Adolf Hitler, who used the pseudonym Wolf during the early years of the Nazi movement. His godfather was the Führer himself. He was 3 years old when his father disappeared into the skies over Scotland, and he wouldn't see him again under normal conditions for decades. Ilse Hess, his mother, received the news of her husband's flight with a mixture of stupor and complex pride. True to the ideology she shared with Rudolf, she refused to condemn him publicly and withdrew with little Wolf to the family home in Bad Oberdorf, a village in the Bavarian Alps where mother and son lived the war years in isolation that the fall of the Reich turned into a stigma. Ilse was arrested on June 3, 1947, and transferred to the internment camp of Augsburg-Göggingen, where she was held until March 1948. Wolf, who was 10 years old at the time, was left in the care of relatives. Rudolf Hess was tried in Nuremberg in 1946 and sentenced to life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit crimes against peace and crimes of aggression. The court rejected the death penalty requested by some prosecutors, in part because his role in the regime's most direct atrocities was more difficult to document than that of other defendants. He was transferred to Spandau prison in West Berlin, where he remained as a prisoner for more than 4 decades, sharing a facility with other convicts from Nuremberg, and finally, from 1966, as the only prisoner in a prison built for 600 inmates and jointly administered by the 4 Allied powers. Wolf Rüdiger Hess grew up with that reality as a permanent backdrop. He studied architecture in Munich and built a professional career in that field, but the figure of his father in chains in Spandau became the gravitational axis of his adult life. In 1967, at the age of 30, he began a public and political campaign to obtain Rudolf's release, arguing that his father's advanced age, who had passed 70 years of age, and his deteriorating state of health made his continued confinement cruel and unnecessary. He gained support from German and British politicians, including Willy Brandt. The Soviet Foreign Ministry, headed by Andrei Gromyko, systematically vetoed any proposal for release, arguing that Hess had never shown any remorse and that he continued to proclaim his innocence. That was true. In his final statement before the Nuremberg tribunal, Rudolf Hess himself had declared, "If I had to start over, I would act as I have acted, even if I knew that in the end a bonfire was waiting for me to die." On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess was found dead in the garden of Spandau prison with an electrical cable around his neck. He was 93 years old. The prison authorities declared it a suicide. Wolf Rüdiger Hess vehemently rejected that version. He spent the next few years researching the circumstances of his father's death and published 2 books about it. My Father, Rudolf Hess, 1986, and Who Murdered My Father, Rudolf Hess, published after the old man's death. In both, he argued that the British intelligence services had murdered his father to prevent him, once freed, from revealing compromising information about London's actions during the war. No independent research corroborated that theory. But what is relevant to our story is not whether Wolf Rüdiger was right or wrong in his hypothesis about his father's death. What is relevant is what he chose to do with his life. Defend him. Not from indifference or from comfortable denial, but with the active energy of someone who builds a cause. In this sense, Wolf Rüdiger is more like Gudrun Himmler than any other son of a Nazi hierarch we will examine. He chose the wrong side of history with his eyes open. Wolf Rüdiger Hess died on October 24, 2001 in Munich, at the age of 63. To the end, he professed admiration for his father and for the man who had been his godfather. There was an orchard. There was also a swimming pool, a well-kept garden with seasonal flowers, carefully pruned apple trees, and a greenhouse where tomatoes grew neatly in their wooden stakes. Rudolf Höss's 5 children played in that garden almost every day. The eldest, Klaus, was fond of horses. Brigitte collected wild strawberries. The little ones ran around the lawn with the barking of the family dogs as background music. 200 meters from the garden wall, Auschwitz-Birkenau began. Rudolf Höss was appointed the first commandant of the Auschwitz concentration camp on May 4, 1940, when he arrived in the small Polish town of Oświęcim, about 60 kilometers west of Krakow, with the mission of transforming a cavalry barracks of the Polish army into what would become the largest extermination complex in history. What it built over the next few years is unprecedented in human history. A system of 3 main fields and 45 subfields capable of processing, and the word process is already a bureaucratic distortion of horror, to more than 10,000 people per day at peak times. It is estimated that between 1.1 and 1.5 million people were killed in Auschwitz under his command, the vast majority Jews deported from all the occupied countries of Europe. While this was happening, Hedwig Höss, his wife, was cultivating the garden. According to the memoirs Rudolf wrote during his captivity before he was executed, he himself had overseen the construction and expansion of the family villa, adding wings, improving the facilities, and making sure his wife and children had everything they could need. "All the wishes expressed by my wife or my children were granted," he wrote. The furniture in the dining room had been confiscated from deported Polish families. The fur coats that Hedwig wore in winter came from the warehouses of objects confiscated from the deportees when they arrived at the camp. Brigitte Höss, the eldest daughter, recounted decades later that children picked strawberries in the garden without knowing that the black dust that sometimes covered them was ash from crematoria. On certain mornings, when the wind blew from the east, a peculiar smell penetrated through the open windows of the villa. Hedwig ordered them to be closed. When Höss was arrested by British forces in March 1946, hiding under the identity of a farmer in the German town of St. Michaelisdonn in Schleswig-Holstein, his children were between 4 and 14 years old. He was tried in Poland, sentenced to death by the Polish National Supreme Court on April 2nd of 1947, and hanged on April 16th of that same year, in the same place where he had exercised his authority for years, next to the first gas chamber of Auschwitz. The Höss's life after their father's execution was the story of a free fall from privilege to stigma. Hedwig refused to look for work and relied for years on informal support networks among former Nazis. The 5 children grew up dispersed, trying to rebuild lives under the weight of a surname that history had made synonymous with industrial genocide. Klaus Höss, the eldest, eventually emigrated to Australia. There he built a life that very few people around him knew in its entirety. He changed his last name. He didn't talk about his father for decades. Brigitte Höss, who had last seen her father as a young child, would end up living in the United States. In 2008, when the documentary The Architect of Evil re-examined the life of Rudolf Höss, some of his descendants gave brief testimonies about what it had meant to grow up in that villa in the shadow of Auschwitz. His words exuded a mixture of trauma and perplexity that had no equivalent in any psychology book. They had grown up loving a father who was, at the same time, one of the most efficient mass murderers the world had ever known. In 2023, director Jonathan Glazer brought the story of the Höss family to the cinema in The Zone of Interest, a film based on the novel of the same name by Martin Amis. The film won the Oscar for Best International Film that same year and captured, with a visual coldness that proved devastating, exactly what historical documents already knew: that horror and domesticity can coexist without either cancelling out the other, that the garden can be watered while on the other side of the wall the worst crimes in history are committed. They called him Kronprinz, the Crown Prince. Within the inner circle of the Nazi hierarchy, Martin Bormann's eldest son was considered the natural successor to the man who was, in practical terms, the second most powerful man in the Reich. His father, Martin Bormann Sr., had climbed to the top of the pyramid of power with a combination of bureaucratic brutality, fanatical loyalty, and the ability to control access to the Führer that no other hierarch had been able to match. As head of the party chancellery and Hitler's personal secretary, Bormann Sr. decided who could talk to the dictator, what documents came to his desk, and which proposals never reached him. For many party leaders, including men like Göring and Goebbels, Bormann Sr. was more fearsome than any external enemy. He was the gatekeeper. Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. was born on April 14, 1930. The eldest of Bormann Sr.'s 10 children, with Gerda Buch, daughter of party leader Max Buch. He was named after the Führer, who was also his godfather. He grew up in Obersalzberg, the mountain resort in the Bavarian Alps, where Hitler had his retirement from the Berghof and where the party elite spent periods of rest or deliberation. In this environment, the children of the hierarchs crossed paths with Hitler on the way to breakfast. Adolf ruffled their hair. He gave them candy. It was Uncle Adolf. When Bormann Jr. began to show behavioral problems and poor academic performance, his father made a decision that spoke volumes about the educational methods of the Nazi elite. He was sent to a Napola on the shores of Lake Starnberg in Bavaria. This institution, described even by the parents most committed to Nazism as a place of extreme harshness, applied a discipline that combined paramilitary training, the memorization of Mein Kampf and ideological training with days of physical exercise that began before dawn and did not end until late at night. By the age of 13, Martin Jr. was already training with weapons, parading in uniform and reciting entire paragraphs of the Führer's book as if they were prayers. On May 2, 1945, when Soviet troops were taking Berlin and Hitler had already died in his bunker, Martin Bormann Sr. tried to escape from the encircled city. He died during that escape attempt, although his body was not identified with certainty until 1998, when DNA analysis carried out on skeletal remains found in Berlin definitively confirmed his identity. For decades, the hypothesis that he had managed to escape to Argentina fueled theories of a network of escaped Nazis in South America. For Martin Adolf Bormann Jr., then 15 years old, the collapse of the Reich was simultaneously the disappearance of both parents. His mother Gerda had died of cancer in March 1946, and his father had disappeared without a trace. He found himself alone, in a Hitler Youth uniform and the swastika sewn on his arm, facing a world that had destroyed everything it knew. He wandered for weeks on the roads of Bavaria until he was picked up by a shepherd named Theodor Schmid, who took him into his farm and offered him what the boy had never known in his ideological upbringing: unconditional kindness. The experience was, according to his own later statements, the beginning of a transformation that would lead him to walk the path most unexpected for the son of man who was called the Führer's demon. He converted to Catholicism and years later was ordained a priest. As Father Bormann, as he was known in the church circles he preferred, he devoted much of his adult life to working as a missionary in conflict zones in the Congo and other African countries, and then as a teacher and educator. He actively participated in conferences and debates on generational culpability and German collective responsibility. He did not avoid talking about his father. He confronted him directly, with words that oscillated between the recognition of horror and the persistence of a filial affection that he could not simply extinguish. "I don't hate him," he said in one of the few interviews he gave. "For many years I learned to differentiate between my father as an individual and my father as a Nazi politician and officer." This exercise in separation, which some post-traumatic psychology scholars have called narrative dissociation from the parental object, was both their way of survival and their most visible moral limit. Because Bormann Sr. was not just an official who signed documents. He was the man who pushed through the most aggressive policies of persecution of Catholics, Jews and Slavs in the occupied territories, who administered forced labor with ruthless efficiency, and who kept the Führer isolated from any moderating voice until the final collapse. Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. was accused in 2011, already in his last years of life, of having committed sexual abuse against students during his time as an educator. He alleged senile dementia. The judicial process was frustrated by his health problems, and he died without having been tried. On March 11, 2013, Martin Adolf Bormann Jr. died in Germany. He was 82 years old. Niklas Frank, known as Niklas, was born in 1939, the youngest of 5 children Hans Frank had with his wife Brigitte Herbst. He was so young when the war began that his first conscious memories are of the halls of Wawel Castle in Krakow, Poland, where his father was installed as Governor-General of the German-occupied Polish territories. Hans Frank, a lawyer by training, an early member of the Nazi Party, and Hitler's personal legal advisor in the 1920s, was appointed Governor-General on October 12, 1939, weeks after the invasion of Poland. From the royal castle of the Polish kings, transformed into the seat of German power with a speed that left no doubt about the intention of permanence, Frank administered a territory with 12 million inhabitants, with methods that combined systematic terror, forced labor, and racial extermination. The Jews of the region were concentrated in ghettos first and deported to the death camps later. The Warsaw Ghetto, the largest in all of occupied Europe, was created under its jurisdiction in November 1940. The estimates most widely accepted by historians indicate that approximately 4 million people died under his direct rule. Niklas's mother, Brigitte, was known in Nazi circles as the Queen of Poland. He walked around Krakow in confiscated fur coats, hosted banquets in the halls of the Wawel, and smoked the same Camel cigarettes that Niklas smokes today, decades later, in the small wooden booth next to his home in Echlach, a village near Hamburg. Hans Frank suspected that Niklas might not be his biological son and called him Fremdi, stranger or foreigner. That nickname defines with unintentional cruelty the relationship between them. Niklas Frank was one of the children who saw Poland with the eyes of someone who belongs to the side of power. He remembers being taken by his mother to the Krakow ghetto of when he was 4 years old. He had felt the confusion in the eyes of the Jewish children who were looking at him from the other side of the fence. I didn't understand what I saw. No one explained it to him. No one in that world had any interest in me understanding it. Hans Frank was captured by American forces in May 1945 in the Bavarian town of Berchtesgaden. He carried with him 38 volumes of his personal diary, a meticulous record of his activities as Governor-General that would become one of the most incriminating documents of the Nuremberg trial. At his trial, he was one of the few defendants who admitted to committing crimes, declaring that 1,000 years will not suffice to erase Germany's guilt. He was sentenced to death and hanged on October 16, 1946. Niklas Frank was 7 years old. What came next was a childhood and adolescence marked by poverty, stigma, and the manipulation of a mother who never renounced the narrative of greatness that Nazism had bestowed on her. Brigitte Frank died without acknowledging her husband's crimes. Niklas grew up accumulating a grudge that was not against the abstract regime, but towards those two concrete fathers. The father who chose the path of extermination and the mother who glorified him until his last breath. Only when he was over 50 years old did Niklas Frank sit down to write. The result was Der Vater, The Father, published in 1987, a book extraordinary in its deliberate cruelty, a systematic page-by-page condemnation of the man who fathered him. It is not a conventional history book. It is a personal reckoning, written with the precision of someone who has spent decades breaking down every act of his father to find the marrow of evil. When asked about Hans Frank, Niklas replies clearly that not only does he not forgive him, but that he actively supported his death sentence. "I am against the death penalty," he said, "except in the case of my father. I'm selfish." In the lectures he gives in German schools, Niklas Frank carries a photograph with him. Not that of the father in uniform, not that of the governor in the halls of the Wawel. It bears the photograph of Hans Frank dead, hanging on the gallows of Nuremberg. The sample. Explain what it represents. And it does not ask for understanding or absolve anyone of the responsibility to look. In 2015, documentary filmmaker Philippe Sands made the film My Nazi Legacy, in which Niklas Frank and Horst von Wechter, son of Otto von Wechter, Nazi governor of Galicia and part of Poland, traveled together through the places where their parents exercised power. The contrast between the two is the perfect synthesis of all possible choices. Niklas condemns unambiguously. Horst defends his father with a mixture of filial love and historical denial that is both emotionally understandable and historically unacceptable. Two children, the same past, opposite answers. Niklas Frank lives today in the small village of Echlach near Hamburg. Keep smoking Camel. He continues to give lectures. He is 82 years old. In July 2011, at a New York auction room, a collection of 3,380 pages of handwritten manuscripts sold for $245,000. The buyer was the son of a Holocaust survivor, an ultra-Orthodox Jew who claimed to have acquired the notebooks for the purpose of publishing them as a tool against denialism. The notebooks which covered the period between 1960 and 1975, contained poems, sketches, autobiographical notes, and ideological reflections on eugenics, racial mixing, and what their author called the problem of overpopulation. The author was Josef Mengele. Dr. Josef Mengele, an SS Hauptsturmführer trained in medicine and physical anthropology from the universities of Munich and Frankfurt, arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau in May 1943. For the next 21 months, he conducted what he called scientific research on the camp's prisoners, using a methodology that the medical and scientific community later judged to be torture disguised as science. His central obsession was twins. He subjected them to parallel experiments to study the effects of different treatments on genetically identical organisms, which allowed him, in his logic, to double the data of each death. He also conducted experiments with people of short stature, with individuals of different eye colors, and with newborns. The prisoners who arrived on the transports at the Birkenau ramp remember him standing impeccably uniformed, pointing with a finger to the right or to the left. To the right, forced labor. On the left, the gas chamber. This image, repeated in thousands of survivor testimonies, earned him the nickname the Angel of Death. In January 1945, as the Red Army approached Auschwitz, Mengele fled. He crossed Europe with false documentation, and in 1949 arrived in Argentina, where the escape network known as Odessa and the connection of the Catholic Church through certain refugee aid organizations, the so-called rat lines or escape lines, facilitated his installation under the name of Helmut Gregor. He lived in Buenos Aires and in the interior of Argentina until 1960, when the capture of Adolf Eichmann by the Mossad persuaded him to leave the country. He moved first to Paraguay and then to Brazil, where he lived his last years in Sao Paulo and in the town of Bertioga. Rolf Mengele was born in 1944, when his father was already in Auschwitz. His mother, Irina Mengele, raised him in post-war Germany, surrounded by the silence that the family on his father's side imposed as a survival policy. Until he was 12, Rolf did not know that his father existed. The official explanation was that he had died in combat. The correspondence the boy received from a certain Uncle Fritz was actually from his own father, who wrote under various false names from South America. In 1956, two simultaneous revelations shook the ordered world of the 12-year-old boy. The first, his father had not died. The second, that father was Josef Mengele. The reactions of his schoolmates were immediate and brutal. The insults were repeated for years. Little Nazi. Your father is a criminal. Son of a murderer. Rolf Mengele grew up with that burden, and with a curiosity that he himself described as not exactly loving, but closer to the need to solve an enigma. What was the man from whom he descended like? What explained what he had done? Was it possible to find in him any answer that would give meaning to the abyss? In 1977, Rolf obtained a passport under a false name and traveled to Brazil to meet his father. What he found was a 66-year-old man who lived in permanent fear of being discovered, who had lost the arrogance of the hierarch but not the conviction of the ideologue. When Rolf asked him directly about Auschwitz, about the experiments, about the deaths, Mengele replied evasively. His job, he said, had been to determine who was fit to work. Rolf didn't believe him. I had no reason to do so. The conversation was the last between them. The relationship had ended in that room in Sao Paulo. On February 7th, 1979, Josef Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming on the beach of Bertioga and drowned. He was 67 years old. He was buried in the municipality of Embu das Artes, in the state of Sao Paulo, under the false name of Wolfgang Gerhard. His death was not publicly known until 1985, when his remains were exhumed and identified through forensic analysis. Rolf Mengele, who knew where his father was buried, kept silent during those 6 years due to pressure from his father's family. In 1985, Rolf decided to break that silence. She spoke to the press and told her story with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. She had not loved her father in any sense that could be called love, but neither had she been able to avoid the disturbing attraction of wanting to understand. She changed her surname to her mother's so that her children would not carry the stigma of the name Mengele. In 2008, he spoke publicly again, this time to ask for forgiveness from the Jewish communities and the families of the victims of Auschwitz. In July 2011, when Josef Mengele's diaries were auctioned off in New York, Rolf did not comment. I had nothing to add. In August 2013, a 79-year-old German architect took part in an urban planning symposium in Frankfurt and spoke about the future of sustainable cities. He was a man of slim build, completely white hair, and a way of speaking that combined technical precision with philosophical reflection. He had been running away from a single question for decades, which nevertheless always caught up with him. Are you Albert Speer's son? Yes, it was. Albert Speer Jr. was the son of the Reich architect, of the Minister of Armaments and War Production, of the man whom the judges of Nuremberg had been sentenced to 20 years in prison, and who, in his memoirs published in 1969 under the title Memoirs of the Third Reich, had constructed with literary mastery the image of the good Nazi, the artist trapped among monsters, the man of sensibility who did not know what was happening. That image, which for decades was accepted with a certain benevolence by a part of Western historiography, began to crumble from the 90s, when more rigorous research showed that Albert Speer Sr. was fully aware of the use of slave labor in the arms factories he managed. He knew. He was not an artist lost in machinery, he was one of the functional cogs of that machinery. Albert Speer Jr. himself publicly supported that review. My father was not innocent, he said in a 2010 interview with the Süddeutsche Zeitung newspaper. I am aware of what he did. It has taken me my whole life to say it clearly. Albert Speer Jr. followed the family tradition of architecture. So did his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. In 1964, he founded the practice Albert Speer and Partner in Frankfurt, which over time became one of the most respected architecture and urban planning firms in Germany. His work distinguished itself from his father's in everything that could be distinguished. Where the father built monuments intended to intimidate, the son designed spaces designed for people. He was involved in the urban planning of cities in Saudi Arabia and China, and designed sports facilities for the Olympic Games. His firm was selected to design the stadiums for the 2010 South Africa and Qatar 2022 World Cups, an irony of history that the global media did not let pass. The son of Hitler's architect building the stadiums of the most watched sporting event on the planet. Albert Speer Jr. died on September 15, 2017 in Frankfurt at the age of 83. To the end, he resented being called Junior. His siblings, 6 in total, followed different trajectories. Most tried to distance themselves from the surname with more or less success. Some changed their names, others emigrated. The father's legacy was, for all of them, a stone that they carried with varying degrees of visibility, but without ever being able to deposit it completely. On May 1, 1945, in the bunker under the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, as the Red Army fought street by street less than a kilometer from where they stood, Magda Goebbels prepared her 6 children for death. They had been in that bunker for days. Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th. The Reich had collapsed. The sound of Soviet shells was constant. Ceilings vibrated with each impact, and dust cascaded from cracks in the concrete. Helga was 12 years old, Hildegard, 11, Helmut, 9, Holdine, 8, Hedwig, 6, Heidrun, 4. In a letter written to her eldest son Harold, who at the time was a prisoner of the Allies in Italy, Magda Goebbels explained her decision with the coldness of someone who has come to an irrefutable conclusion. The world that will come after the Führer and National Socialism does not deserve us to live in it. I take the children with me because they are too good for the life to come. A merciful God will understand that he will give them salvation. SS dentist Helmut Kuntz administered morphine to the 6 children to put them to sleep. Magda Goebbels, according to forensic reconstructions carried out decades later, personally inserted a cyanide capsule between the teeth of each one while they slept. Analyses of the remains found in the Chancellery's garden in 1945 confirmed that Helga, the eldest, had marks on her body consistent with an attempt at resistance before she died. She may not have been completely asleep. Helga was 12 years old. He resisted. Joseph Goebbels and Magda committed suicide shortly after, he shooting himself, she ingesting cyanide. The 6 children were provisionally buried in the garden of the Chancellery. His remains would not be recovered and definitively identified until the 1990s. Traudl Junge, Hitler's last personal secretary, who was in the bunker during those days and who in 2002 starred in the documentary Im Toten Winkel, Hitler's Blind Spot, recalled that Magda Goebbels had told her days before, "It is better for my children to die than to grow up in shame and shame. Our children have no place in a Germany like the one that will come after the war." Harold Quandt, Magda's son from her first marriage to industrialist Günther Quandt, survived captivity. He was released in 1947. He returned to Germany and took over the management of the Quandt Business Group, one of the largest industrial empires in West Germany, ranging from textiles and pharmaceuticals to a decisive stake in BMW. He died in 1967 in a plane crash over Italy. Her 4 daughters inherited a considerable fortune and the complex legacy of a mother who chose to kill her siblings rather than see them grow up without the Reich. Few German surnames carry the weight of horror as accurately as Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann, SS Obersturmbannführer and head of Section 4B4 of the Reich Security Central Office, RSHA, was the official in charge of coordinating the logistics of the deportation and extermination of European Jewry. He was the man who ensured that trains arrived on time at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor and Belzec. When in 1944 he coordinated the deportation of more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews to the death camps within just 2 months, he demonstrated an administrative efficiency whose only measurable consequence was death. Eichmann escaped from Germany in 1945, used the false name Ricardo Clement and settled in Argentina, where he lived in the Buenos Aires suburb known as Florida, in the province of Buenos Aires, in conditions of relative anonymity. On May 11, 1960, Israeli Mossad agents captured him on Garibaldi Street in San Fernando after months of surveillance. He was clandestinely transferred to Israel, where he was tried in Jerusalem in 1961 and executed by hanging on May 31, 1962. It was the first and to date only case in which Israel applied the death penalty. Adolf Eichmann had 4 sons: Klaus, Horst, Dieter, and Ricardo. Their paths diverged in ways that no screenwriter could have imagined. Klaus Eichmann, the eldest, and Horst Eichmann, the second, followed their father in his convictions. When Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires, Klaus and Horst, who also lived in Argentina, tried by various means to organize his rescue. They founded, along with other Nazi sympathizers in the country, the Argentine National Socialist Front, an organization created with the declared purpose of pressuring for their father's return from Israel. The organization failed in its objective as expected. After Eichmann's execution in 1962, the front mutated. It abandoned the political facade and began to operate in criminal activities with an anti-communist orientation, developing links with the Tacuara movement, an Argentine nationalist group that combined anti-Semitism with actions of street terrorism. Tacuara came to be responsible for bomb attacks in Buenos Aires in the 60s. Dieter Eichmann, the 3rd child, took an intermediate and discreet stance that essentially consisted of disappearing from public life. Ricardo Eichmann, the youngest, chose the opposite path to that of his older brothers. He became an archaeologist and developed a recognized academic career in Germany in the field of archaeology of the Near East. He does not give interviews about his father. He has never denied the crimes of Eichmann Sr., but neither has he sought to turn his life into a public statement. Along with Albert Speer Jr. and Martin Bormann Jr., he founded or supported organizations dedicated to assisting victims of Nazism. The contrast between Adolf Eichmann's 4 children is, in a small way, the map of all the possible responses to the legacy of horror. In 1958, every summer, a small alpine village in Austria was filled with men and women with grey hair, who greeted each other in German with a familiarity that excluded any stranger. They were SS veterans, widows of hierarchs, sons of field commanders. They gathered to commemorate what they called the sacrifices of the movement. They considered themselves victims of history. And in the circle, sitting apart but receiving the attention that is paid to royalty, was always Gudrun Himmler Burwitz. The Stille Hilfe organization, Silent Aid, operated as a shadow for decades within post-war German society. It had no official headquarters. It did not publish balance sheets. It did not register members in any accessible registry. It functioned through a network of personal contacts, private bank accounts, and absolute trust between people who shared the secret of their past. Its mission, as defined by its own members in the rare moments when they spoke of it, was to take care of our own. The ours included SS officers convicted of war crimes who were serving sentences in German prisons and who received financial support for their families through the organization. They also included fugitives who had escaped to South America and who needed to renew false documentation, get new identities, or simply receive money to survive. And in documented cases, they also included criminals facing extradition and whose legal defense costs were partially covered through the organization's funds. One of those cases was that of Klaus Barbie. Johann Barbie, known as Klaus, born in 1913 in Bad Godesberg, was a Gestapo officer in Lyon between 1942 and 1944. During that period, he oversaw the torture and execution of French resistors, Jews, and people from all walks of life who fell into the hands of the German security police. It is estimated that he was responsible for the deaths of between 4,000 and 14,000 people in that region. Among its best-known victims is Jean Moulin, the leader of the French resistance, who was arrested in June 1943 and died under torture. Barbie managed to escape France with the help of post-war evacuation networks and arrived in Bolivia, where she lived under the name Klaus Altmann for more than 30 years. In 1983, he was extradited to France, where he was tried in Lyon, the city where he had committed his crimes, and sentenced in 1987 to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. He died in prison in 1991. During those years of trial, Stille Hilfe and Gudrun Himmler Burwitz contributed, according to journalistic investigations that have not been refuted, to finance part of their legal defense. Gudrun never directly confirmed or denied these claims. His only recorded statement on the matter, to the British journalist who arrived at his door in 2015, was, "I never talk about my work. I just do what I can and when I can." It is a phrase that could be interpreted as that of a person who simply rejects intrusion, or as someone who knows exactly what they have done and has no intention of apologizing for it. There is a third path between active defense and public condemnation, and many children of Nazi hierarchs took it: silence. Not the vehement denial of Gudrun Himmler or the direct confrontation of Niklas Frank, but silence as a survival strategy and as a way of not having to answer a question that has no satisfactory answer. That silence had different textures. Edda Göring spoke publicly on a few occasions throughout her life, but always within the limits of the domestic, the private, the affective. The Reich as a system, as a machinery of extermination, as a political project, did not exist in his stories. There was only the father who gave him gifts, the mother who taught him how to behave, the godfather Adolf who ruffled his hair on visits to the Berghof. Rolf Mengele spoke, but it took him decades to do so. And when he did, it was with the sobriety of someone who knows that no words can reduce the weight of what he carries. He changed his last name, he apologized to the victims, and then he fell silent again. Klaus Höss, the eldest son of the Auschwitz commandant, emigrated to Australia. He changed his last name. He did not speak. Wolf Rüdiger Hess spoke, but in the opposite direction. He used his voice to defend his father and to claim his innocence. He too chose silence about the regime's crimes, but it was an active silence shaped by ideology. In all these cases, there is a common denominator that psychologists specializing in the so-called transgenerational trauma have identified in decades of work with descendants of perpetrators. The difficulty of separating filial love from the moral evaluation of the father's actions. Loving someone and recognizing that someone was a criminal are not cognitive operations that the human brain executes easily. Childhood builds effective bonds before adult reason can question them. And when that adult reason finally arrives, he is confronted with an image of the father that has been built by years of coexistence, of memories charged with emotion, of moments that are nothing like the monster that history books describe. That is why Edda Göring remembered a father who gave her paintings. That's why Gudrun Himmler remembered a father who called her Puppy and flew her on a plane to see her. That's why Martin Bormann Jr. said he didn't hate his father even though he acknowledged his crimes. The love they felt as children was real. What his parents did was also important. And the impossibility of reconciling these two realities is the wound that these men and women carried throughout their lives. In 2007, two women made a decision that in any other context would have seemed merely personal, but in theirs had the gravity of a historic statement. Bettina Göring and her brother, also called, in the documentary source, her cousin, decided to undergo voluntary sterilization. The exact history of this branch of the Göring family is complex. According to the 2011 documentary Hitler's Children, made by Israeli director Chanoch Ze'evi, several descendants of Nazi hierarchs spoke with unusual openness about their relationship with the legacy of their ancestors. Among them, Bettina Göring, Hermann Göring's great-niece, declared that she had undergone voluntary sterilization at the age of 30. His brother, whose full name was not publicly revealed, reportedly made the same decision, the stated reason to make sure that the family line did not continue, that no one else was born with the surname Göring. "I don't want to pass on that last name," Bettina said. "I don't want any other child to carry what I've carried." This decision, which can be interpreted in multiple ways, from the most radical act of responsibility imaginable to a form of self-punishment that does not correspond to anyone other than the perpetrator himself, precisely defines the depth of trauma that the Göring surname represents for those who carry it without having chosen it. Bettina Göring worked for years as a counselor and therapist, publicly acknowledging her great-uncle's crimes and dedicating part of her life to educating about the Holocaust. When talking about the children of Nazi leaders, it's easy to forget that behind each individual story is a data architecture that gives that story its real dimension. The main hierarchs of the Third Reich, who were tried in Nuremberg or identified as directly responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, left a number that is difficult to quantify precisely, but estimated by different historians at more than 200 direct children and first-generation descendants. If the circle is extended to include concentration camp commanders, regional SS chiefs, governors of the occupied territories, and senior officials in the Reich's police and bureaucratic apparatus, that number is multiplied by orders of magnitude. Most of these children were not the object of historical or journalistic attention. They changed their surnames, they emigrated, They lived silent lives in German, Austrian, Argentine, Australian and American cities without anyone around them knowing who their parents had been. Some scholars of post-war German history have argued that the absence of a systematic program of psychological accompaniment for the descendants of perpetrators was one of the quietest mistakes of the denazification process. The Allied institutions and then the German state concentrated on judging those directly responsible with very different results. Insufficient, given that most of the crimes were never tried, and in educating society as a whole. But no one wondered what happened in homes where 10, 12 or 15-year-olds knew that their parents were in prison for having committed unimaginable crimes or knew that their parents had died without facing any trial. The result of that emptiness is visible in the stories we have gone through. Some of those people found their own path to confrontation and responsibility. Others got lost in the defense of the aggressor because it was the only way to preserve the image of the father they loved as children. And others simply disappeared, making silence their only possible response. In the autumn of 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and divided Germany began its process of reunification, a question that had never been fully answered was also reopened. How do you build a national identity that includes the memory of Nazism without that inclusion turning into glorification or amnesia? The German answer to that question has been, by historical comparison, remarkable. The Federal Republic of Germany instituted from very early on legal mechanisms for the prosecution of war crimes which, although imperfect and insufficient in their first decades, increased their effectiveness over time. The most recent and emblematic trial was that of Oskar Gröning, the accountant of Auschwitz, tried in 2015 at the age of 93 for complicity in the murder of 300,000 people and sentenced to 4 years in prison. Gröning was the symbol that Germany had no intention of allowing the memory of these crimes to be prescribed. At the same time, Holocaust education was made compulsory in German school curricula since the 1960s, with a depth that progressively increased. Memorials proliferated. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, inaugurated in Berlin in 2005, occupies an entire block in the center of the German capital and consists of 2,711 concrete blocks of different heights arranged in a field that the visitor must physically walk. There are no names in those blocks. There are no sculptures. Only volume, space, and the uneasiness of walking among masses of stone whose scale evokes, without representing them, the masses of victims. Figures such as Niklas Frank and Rolf Mengele regularly participate in these initiatives, bringing their testimonies about what it means to grow up knowing who your father was. Their voices are part of a system of collective memory that Germany has built with conscious effort and which, in its imperfection and continuity, represents one of the most serious attempts a nation has ever made to avoid repeating what was. Gudrun Himmler was also involved in those decades, but from the opposite side, using the nostalgic meetings, underground networks and Stille Hilfe's money to keep alive, among those who never gave up on the dream of the Reich, the memory of what it was as a possibility of what it could be again. The contrast between these two projects, that of critical memory and that of complacent memory, is the same that defines the history of all the children of Nazi leaders. It is not a contrast between good and evil in the abstract, but between the conscious choice to look and the equally conscious choice not to look. In Berlin, in the Neukölln district, there is a woman named Monika Goethe. He is a visual artist. His work revolves almost exclusively around his surname, because that surname is that of Amon Goethe, the commandant of the Płaszów concentration camp outside Krakow, whom Schindler portrayed on his list and who was tried and executed in 1946 by the Polish Supreme National Court. Monika Goethe is not Amon Goethe's direct daughter. She is his granddaughter. She never met him. But since he was a teenager and discovered who his grandfather was, he has made that heritage the material of his artistic work and his public reflection. She has participated in documentaries. He has visited the places where his grandfather exercised terror, he has spoken to survivors, and he has come to a conclusion that accurately sums up the dilemma that all descendants of perpetrators face. I didn't ask for this last name, but I have a responsibility for what I do with it. That phrase could have been said by Niklas Frank, by Rolf Mengele, by Albert Speer Jr, or by Edda Göring. It is the phrase that sums up the only morally coherent answer available to someone who was born into such families, not guilt for the crimes of the father, which does not belong to the son, but responsibility for memory, which does belong to him. There are descendants of Nazi hierarchs who chose that responsibility with courage, such as Niklas Frank, who has been showing the photograph of his father's corpse in schools for decades because he believes that the inconvenient truth is the only vaccine against repetition. There are others who chose it with the discretion of someone who prefers silence to spectacle but not oblivion, such as Rolf Mengele, who changed his surname and asked for forgiveness without making it a public career. And there are those who ignored it with the same determination they put into ignoring the crimes their parents committed. The story of the children of Nazi leaders has no single ending or simple moral. It is, like any human story worth telling, a story of contradictions, of love and horror coexisting in the same space, of children who were molded by a regime that used them as propaganda, and then, when that regime fell, were left alone in the face of the question that no ideology can answer. What do I do now with who I am? Gudrun Himmler's response was, I defend what I was. Niklas Frank's response was, I condemn what was. Martin Bormann Jr.'s answer was, I look at the faith what politics cannot give. Rolf Mengele's response was, I apologize and I walk away. Edda Göring's response was, I remember only what I loved. Edda Göring's response was, I interrupt the surname so that it does not continue. None of these answers erases what happened. None of them bring the victims back to life. None repairs the damage of a war that left between 50 and 70 million dead around the world, and that concentrated in Europe the worst systematic genocide in documented history. But some of those responses help keep the memory alive. And memory, as those who studied it know better than anyone, is the only real barrier against repetition.